Okay, calm down.
How can we de-escalate from potential World War III, Ukraine and Gaza? Final, very easy question for you.
Well, I don't think we have to worry much about World War III breaking out as a result of events in Gaza. As horrible as that situation
Yeah.
is, uh, the Russians and the Americans are not eyeball to eyeball there. Ukraine is a different matter. The one positive thing I'll say about the Biden administration is that it's basically had the good sense to be very careful with regard to escalation and the potential of uh, causing a nuclear war. The Biden people are fully aware that we in the West have to be extremely careful in terms of what we allow the Ukrainians to do. So I think so far so good, and I think we're not in a situation where there is a likelihood that the Russians will turn to nuclear weapons or that we will. Uh, so I don't worry that much at the moment. Uh, if the Ukrainian army cracks, it crumbles, which might very well happen later this year, maybe late this summer or in the fall. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but if the Ukrainian army cracks and it looks like the Russian army is in a position to take lots of territory in Ukraine, the question is, what do we do then? Uh, and the polls have made it clear that if that happens and they see the Russians moving west towards the Polish border, they will intervene. I'm not sure that they would. I'm not sure that we wouldn't land on them like a ton of bricks if they tried to do that and tell them they can't do that. I'm not sure they'd pay attention to us. Who knows? But you can tell plausible stories, and I'm choosing my language carefully here, not likely stories, but plausible stories, how we, the United States, get involved in the shooting in Ukraine. And then you have a great power war, and then you're on the slippery slope to nuclear escalation. So that's not a case of where Russia all of a sudden decides to use nuclear weapons. It's a case where you get a great power war first. And the end result of that great power war is you're on the slippery slope to nuclear escalation. And you again can tell plausible stories about how that happens. But I think at this point in time, we're far enough away from that we don't have to worry too much. We have to be very careful, and hopefully, the Biden administration will continue to be as prudent as possible on this front. Uh, but uh, but anyway, that's where I think we are.
That's not quite as scary as I thought it would perhaps be. Though there's climate change that we can be anxious about.
But I mean, one good thing about the Biden administration and Biden's age is that he's old enough to remember the Cold War, and people who remember the Cold War and who didn't come of age during the unipolar moment, people who came of age during the Cold War, were taught a lot about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And I think older people like Biden, like myself, tend to be very, very cautious when it comes to nuclear weapons. Because that's the way we were socialized during the Cold War. I think a lot of young people who grew up in the unipolar moment when the threat of nuclear war was hardly taken seriously have not thought long and hard about this. And sometimes when I listen to younger people talk about, a US Russian war in Ukraine, and they dismiss the
Right.
possibility of nuclear escalation, I say to myself, this is not the way you want to think about this issue, right?
Right.
The
Or
key point to remember, if I could just make one
yeah, of
final
course, yeah.
point, key point to remember is that thankfully we've never had a nuclear war, right? I mean, obviously, nuclear weapons were used at the end of World War II, but only one side had nuclear weapons. And thankfully, they were only used briefly. But we've never had a nuclear war where you had two nuclear armed powers and one of them used nuclear weapons. All of that is to say, we do not understand the escalation dynamics that would attend that war. We just don't know much about nuclear escalation. We just don't know how it would work because thankfully we have no evidence that we can turn to figure out what it looks like. So it's very important to understand that if you get into a war in Ukraine and nuclear weapons are used, we're in virgin territory. You know, we're feeling our way around in the dark here. And given the consequences of nuclear weapons being used, you want to be careful in the extreme. You know, a lot of people will say these days, oh, there's hardly any
Right.
chance would be used in Ukraine if we got involved. Well, if there's hardly any chance, let's say you agree there's hardly any chance, shouldn't hardly any chance scare the living bejesus out of you simply because of the consequences associated with these weapons? I mean, we could all get vaporized. I mean, even if there's hardly any chance, do you want to take that small chance? It's that kind of thing. So anyway, I think the Biden administration, to President Biden's credit, is aware of this. I think most of his advisors are as well. And for that reason, I think they have been quite cautious on this whole escalation issue. And as a result, I don't worry that much at this point in time. I want to be clear. I worry, but I don't worry that.
Slightly less reassured than before, but it's good to be level-headed about all this stuff.
No question about that.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Professor Mearsheimer. This has been such an amazing talk, and I know you're so in demand. So I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Great, and definitely next time you have some free time, we'd love to have you back.
Let's do that.